Rhondda Robinson Thomas. I am the Calhoun Lemon Professor of Literature at Clemson University, where I research and teach early African American literature. I began working on Call My Name Clemson. I like to say the first day I arrived at the university back in 2007. I came as a postdoc, which means I was going to work for about 3 years, teaching a couple of classes and doing my research, writing my book, and looking for work at another university. I had no intentions of staying at Clemson. But on that very first day on campus, my colleague, Dr. Michael Lemieux, met me in the parking lot, brought me to our office building, showed me the library, our main classroom building, and then he said, I need to show you something. And we walked to the center of campus, and he asked me to look up a hill. And at the top of that hill was his house. It was a 2-story house with pillars. And in my mind, I was thinking it looked a lot like a plantation house. And he looked at me and he said, that's John C. Calhoun's Fort Hill Plantation House. And I thought, how on earth could I have come to Clemson and no one had told me anything about the university being built on a plantation? I hated historic plantations. At that point, I had very bad experiences going to them for visits and hearing a whole lot about everything but enslaved people. So the thought of working on a historic plantation that had a historic house in the center, I wasn't really excited about that, but my husband and I had already sold our house and moved to South Carolina, so we were here to stay. So I decided to make the best of the situation by taking my students to the house on a tour, since we were reading slave narratives that fall in one of my classes, and they resisted. As soon as I mentioned the Fort Hill Plantation House in a tour, they told me that the house was cursed and students who went in the house wouldn't graduate. And I just thought it was absurd that we had a plantation house on our campus and our students were scared to go in it. So my students went on that tour. Of course, they all graduated. But what happened on that tour was really the turning point for me. My students went on the tour by themselves. I went on a tour later. And in both instances, neither of us, neither group, neither did my students or myself heard anything about enslaved people or the system of slavery. And when I asked the tour guide, why not, he said, because the subject was too controversial. I found that really hard to believe, because by this time I had learned that not only was Clemson built on John C. Calhoun's historic Fort Hill Plantation, but that we had a lot of buildings on our campus that were named for Confederate officers, such as Hardin Hall, named after Mark Hardin. We had our most iconic building on our campus, Tillman Hall, was named for a self-avowed white supremacist who also was the governor of South Carolina and a U.S. Senator, Benjamin Tillman. We had the Strom Thurmond Institute at that time, named for a Clemson alum, Strom Thurmond, who went on to be a U.S. Senator, but also a staunch segregationist. There was this history imprinted on the landscape all around me, but we couldn't talk about slavery. So what I decided to do was to find out as much about enslaved people and the system of slavery that had operated on the land as I could. My colleagues and I in the English department began taking our students to Fort Hill and asking that the history of enslavement and the stories of enslaved people be included in those tours. But what we soon learned was that each of us was getting a different tour. And so we would get together in our building and we would compare notes. And I became extremely frustrated because I thought I shouldn't have to work so hard to learn the stories of enslaved people. On one of those tours, another turning point, the guide said there's a list of enslaved people over in special collections. In fact, we have 2 lists, one from 1854 and one from 1865. As soon as my class was over, I went directly to special collections, and the archivist helped me find that document in Thomas Green Clemson's papers. It was the 1854 deed for the sale of the Fort Hill Plantation, and in it there was a list of 50 enslaved persons on what was called a schedule of slaves. They were listed among the various horses and cows and furniture that were being sold with the plantation and the land. And on that list, the youngest was a little baby. Her name's Katie. She was listed as being 0 years old. And the oldest was a woman named Phoebe, who was 100 years old. And in that document, I saw the story of slavery from the cradle to the grave. That little baby didn't know she was property about to be sold to a new owner. And Phoebe, more likely than not, having born about 1754, probably brought over on a slave ship. The whole story of enslavement, of slavery in America, was right on that document. So I kept looking for stories, and as I looked for the stories of enslaved people, a strange thing started happening. I wondered, Clemson was founded in 1889, so what happened on the plantation before the university opened? And I learned that there were sharecroppers, former slaves working for Thomas Green Clemson, the university's founder, during Reconstruction. And then I heard rumors about how the college was built in the 1890s, and people were talking about a convict crew. And they told me they were mostly black, about 50 men. And I asked about, who were they? What were their names? What do we know about them? People told me there were no records. We didn't know anything, but I'm a persistent soul, so I kept looking and searching, and finally, after a few years, found the records. They were sitting in the State Archive over in Columbia, probably for over a century, just waiting for someone to recover them and incorporate that narrative. I thought they would all be men, but there were boys as young as 12 years old, one 12-year-old, many teenagers on that list of incarcerated men and boys who were assigned to work at Clemson, still trying to figure out how many of them actually worked here. But the story kept growing. The next thing I found is there was a photograph in a picture book. There's something in those hills about Clemson. And I'm turning the pages, and all of a sudden there's a picture of Duke Ellington, and I'm wondering, what is Duke Ellington doing at Clemson? I contacted people like, where did this picture come from? No one, again, seemed to know, but finally learned that the Central Dance Association, it was a student group at Clemson, started booking black musicians to perform for social events for students, and Duke Ellington had come in 1955. Subsequently, I've learned that as early as 1920, black musicians were performing for these social events on campus during the Jim Crow era, when there was segregation throughout the South. And then, of course, I heard all about Harvey Gantt. Harvey Gantt desegregated Clemson in 1963. It was peaceful, and the story ended there. And I thought it was a strange story because the story of integration in the South was a very, very challenging story. There were riots that broke out on campuses. There were students who had to be escorted by the National Guard, and I wondered, how on earth was Clemson's integration so peaceful? And so again, I started searching and found that it took nearly 2 years for Harvey Gantt to be admitted as a student. He got so frustrated with the process that he filed a class action lawsuit because he wanted any black person who was qualified to attend Clemson to be admitted. And then Clemson fought that lawsuit all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. That's a very different story than peaceful integration on January 28, 1963. And so I realized that my curiosity about enslaved people had led to recovering of this incredibly rich, deep, complex history of the university's indebtedness to black labor for its creation, its founding, its building, its success. Everything about Clemson was related to the black laborers who worked on this land, but yet their stories were not in the official public narrative of the university. You couldn't go somewhere on the website and learn this history. It just wasn't there. So I went to the president, his name was Jim Barker, early in this process, and I said, hey, universities all over are beginning to look at their history. Let's take a look and see what we can find. At that time, the university wasn't ready. I was told no, that there would not be an official project commissioned by the university, but that I was free to continue my work. And it was a rough rough answer for me. I was a junior faculty member, newly arrived at the university, just here a few years, and here I am, a sixth generation South Carolinian, coming back home after many, many years, working at a university that would not put the resources behind documenting a story that I have found to be quite compelling, a story that was essential for its own public narrative. So I had to make a decision. I had to decide if I was going to stay at Clemson and continue doing this work with no money, with still the responsibilities of fulfilling all the requirements for tenure, or if I was going to leave. And I decided to stay. I decided to stay because the story was that important to me. I was willing to have a dual research track because I could not leave this story behind once I knew that it was so rich, so deep, so complex, so essential for the DNA of this university. So I stayed and I completed the requirements for tenure, and I kept working on a project that would be called Call My Name. Call My Name is evocative of the call and response tradition in African American culture, where the easiest way to describe it is if you're at church and the preacher starts preaching and the audience starts responding, then what they create together is very different than just listening to a sermon quietly or listening to an artist sing a song and not responding. This energy, this synergy that is created between the speaker and the audience creates a communal experience. It creates something new where those two different groups of people come together and experience something together. And so what I wanted with Call My Name is for us to call these names of all of these hundreds of Black folks in Clemson history, because most of that story is not in the archive. It's out in the public. It's in the community. It's the descendants of these families that I wanted to bring back to Clemson to help document that history. It's also related to what happens on our campus in the history of Clemson as well as what goes on in the present day. Clemson was founded as a military school, and so most people are familiar with the cadences that are associated with the military. I've seen the ROTC groups running around campus with the leader calling out songs to those that are running or walking behind him or her. So it evokes that military history. It also evokes what happens in our classrooms. I'm a professor. I call on my students. They answer. They call on each other. We create something together when we're talking about African American literature that wouldn't happen if they were simply listening to a lecture. And lectures are very important, but discussions enable students to engage on a level that is not required of them when they are listening and taking notes. And finally, Clemson has a tradition where at graduation, every student hears their name called. At graduation, you hear your name, you walk up, you take your diploma, you shake hands with the president, you have your moment in the sun. So if your name hasn't been called in any of the time you have been at Clemson, if you come to graduation, you're going to hear your name called publicly to acknowledge the accomplishment that you have attained at graduation. So pulling on the traditions of African American culture and the history and the present realities of Clemson, Call and Response wants to create something with the Clemson community, with local communities, with the public together, recovering, documenting, sharing this important history that still, in spite of my work, is not fully integrated into Clemson's history. So I got to a point where I thought, I need to write a book about my experience in recovering this history. And when I talked to my publisher, they were interested in that story, but when they learned that I was a sixth generation South Carolinian, they also wanted me to incorporate that part of my experience into the book. And so that was the second strand. But the third strand was the university's experience itself, and finally realizing that you know, we have this complicated history and we really do need to tell the complete story. So with my own history, I don't know, this, I'll call it crazy thing happened when I was doing the research. I didn't know my great-great-grandmother Lucretia Earle's birth name, and I asked one of my cousins. They told me it was Wanamaker. I just made a note in our family tree, and I kept doing my work. And I thought that name sounded really familiar. And one day when I was doing some research on the prisoners who helped to build Clemson, I came across this name, John Edward Wanamaker. And I'm staring at that name and saying, that name sounds familiar. And all of a sudden I realized it was my grandmother's birth name. So I quickly began looking up the White Wanamaker's family and discovered that both he and my great-great-grandmother had come from the Orangeburg, South Carolina area. And I got a little nervous and I kept looking. I've had DNA testing done. I went to my results and I found White Wanamaker's, John Edward Wanamaker's relatives in my family tree. So it turns out as I completed this history, I discovered that my family is somehow connected to John Edward Wanamaker, one of the first trustees who was appointed for Clemson. So my family story became part of the Clemson story. The third strand that I just mentioned, that of Clemson trustees becoming interested in documenting Clemson's history, it came out of tragedy, frankly. Back when the mother and Emanuel 9 were murdered by a white supremacist, there was a lot of soul searching that went on around the country. Also because the Confederate battle flag was part of that horrific event, our state went through a lot of soul searching and decided to bring down that Confederate battle flag from the state capitol grounds. Our trustees supported that initiative, and at the same time they decided to create a trustee task force for documenting Clemson history. They made a commitment to tell Clemson's complete story. By that time I was already involved in some projects, putting up some new South Carolina historical markers on campus that documented some of the spaces on campus where African Americans lived and labored. That became one of the first initiatives that was approved with the Clemson Trustee Task Force. So the book explores three strands of this story. The actual recovery, not the discovery, of the lives and labors of African Americans in Clemson University history. It also includes a little bit of my own story growing up as a South Carolinian, but having left the state as a 2-year-old and then coming back home as an adult to work at a university where my parents couldn't attend because they went to school in the 50s when Clemson was still segregated. And then that story of how the university has embraced the desire to tell its complete history and support my efforts in an enormous way with funding, with a postdoc that I have now, with providing space that I need to do the work, with allowing me, after I got tenure and I'm seeking promotion to full professor, the work that I did is the work that I presented as the rationale for that promotion. We've done, a complete 180 from when I got here, where not many people wanted to talk about this history, to people signing up for tours that I give for campus, to people flocking to the website and the social media sites where they can hear a story about a Black person in Clemson history every single day. We've done an enormous amount of work. My team, students have worked with me, grad students have worked with me, faculty members have collaborated. It's become a real team effort supported by Clemson. So the book seeks to tell that story. One other thing that the book does, it begins and ends with voices from the descendant community. I am the facilitator of this process, but I really want to keep the focus on the people whose stories I'm recovering and sharing. So I really wanted people to enter into this history through the voices of those whose stories I'm telling. So the very first voice you hear after the editors introduce the book is that of Eric Young. Eric Young is a direct descendant of Thomas and Franny Frewster, who were enslaved on the Fort Hill plantation by the Calhouns. The Frewster family stayed in the area. Many, many descendants. I meet them every time I have a community meeting. But Eric was the first Frewster descendant to graduate from Clemson. That didn't happen until 1995. And the most interesting thing about that experience is that he didn't know he was a Frewster descendant until after he graduated from Clemson. His family didn't talk openly about that history, but he kept hearing these rumors. People kept wanting to talk to his family members and document that story. And finally, a few years after he graduated, he sat down with some of the elders in his family and they opened it up. So the Frewster family, their matriarch, Juanita Webb, who lives in Pendleton, on occasion they've come to campus, they've come to Call My Name programs to share their family history directly with the public. And on occasions when we can bring in descendants and others to talk directly about their experiences, that's what makes me the most excited. I'm just the conduit, but when people can engage with the history makers, I think that's an even richer experience. The last voice in the book, before my coda, is that of Monica Williams Hudgens. Monica is the granddaughter rather. She is the granddaughter of Strom Thurmond, the biracial granddaughter of Strom Thurmond. Her mother, Essie Mae Washington, did not talk about that relationship while Strom Thurmond was alive. And after he died, she came forward. But it was not until after their mother's death that the children began to talk openly about what it was like growing up. They knew all along that Strom Thurmond was their grandfather, but were not permitted to speak openly about that relationship. And so Monica came to Clemson a few years ago for our Race in the University series and did a presentation. And then I invited her to talk about that experience as well as growing up in the Strom Thurmond family, what that was like, and then what it means to carry on her mother's legacy and to come to terms with being the granddaughter of a man who advocated for segregation so fiercely for so much of his public career. So that's the book. It's the book of how I documented and continue to document the story of Black Americans, of African people who are integral to the history of Clemson University. Since the book came out, we have added another group, and that is 21st century activism. Our students have been very engaged in activism on and off campus. Just last summer, our football players led a peaceful protest in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. But this is a tradition that actually reaches back to the plantation era. In every era of Black history at Clemson, we have evidence of protests, starting with Issy, a young girl who slipped some coals on a feather pillow and started a fire in a back bedroom in the Fort Hill plantation house that, as Mrs. Calhoun said, Issy was trying to burn them all up, to students in the 1960s who, after Martin Luther King was assassinated, came back to campus and started the Student League for Black Identity, which is the first Black student organization on campus. They advocated for the discontinuation of the singing of Dixie and the display of the Confederate battle flag at official university events. It took them from about 1968, 69 to 1972 before those two traditions were discontinued. In the 21st century, you had students like Whitney Anderson, who created a documentary about diversity, what it meant to be a Tiger. It's students who were advocating for a better campus climate. There's so many stories I could tell, and because there's so many stories about student activism, we decided to dedicate the newest generation to them. The wonderful thing about that is that they're here with us, and they can tell their own stories, and we can help ensure that those stories are incorporated into Clemson's public narrative. So Call My Name offers Clemson an opportunity to call the names of these individuals. It offers the public an invitation to join us in documenting and sharing these stories. And it helps to ensure that these names, these stories will never be forgotten.